Hey, welcome to another episode of Some Random Thoughts. I am your host, Ryan Mulkowski, and on today's episode, I have with me Jan Owen. Jan, thank you so much for being on Some Random Thoughts.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be invited.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for the audience, Jan, I just want you to introduce yourself, who you are, the work that you do, where people can find you on social media and on the internet, and just take it away. Introduce us.
Well, I'm a therapist, but I spent most of my life, adult life, in ministry as a worship pastor. So I did a career change at the age of 54 because I was widowed and sort of had to figure out a way to support myself. And ministry was not really very stable financially or otherwise for a woman. Um, and so I decided, okay, what's kind of feels similar to me in some ways. And so I went back to school and became a therapist, and I entered the world of therapy at the time that COVID hit.
What a time. What a
Yeah,
time to enter in that field. Yeah.
yeah. But I have a background before I became a therapist, even in ministry. I did a lot of pastoral care and a lot of volunteer work in similar areas of grief, family care, working with widows and widowers. And then my own journey. So I did a lot of sort of work in what I would think of as people care, maybe
hmm
soul care, people care before I actually, finished my degree. Um, so that's kind of my history. I live in Alabama. I have three adult children. I have remarried um, very happily, very
Yay.
thankfully. Yeah, it's a great gift. Um, let's see. I have two dogs. I don't know if anybody cares about that, but I have two dogs.
I care. I care, Jan. I
Well,
love dogs. I have a dog myself, so I'm a dog
well,
lover.
Ruby, I got Ruby 4 months after my first husband passed away, and I really
Mm,
feel like she kind of saved my life. So she's a
awesome.
huge,
Yeah.
important part of my story.
Good.
Um, but yeah, as far as social media, I mean, I'm on Facebook very rarely.
Mhm.
I do have an Instagram account. It's kind of private, but my Back Porch Counseling is the name of my counseling business.
Okay.
And I do have public, like Facebook accounts and Instagram accounts for that, where I share information about mental health and grief and things like that. On Twitter, I am at Jan Owen. I had to think about it. Uh,
It's okay. Okay.
Jan, the letter J, Owen, no S. Um, I am pretty opinionated on Twitter, so it's not really an account that's just for like grief information or anything.
Right.
I'm pretty personally opinionated there,
Yep.
if that matters to anyone. so
I am too on mine. So look, you're not alone.
yeah.
And you are the author of a book, Fighting Forward. Tell us just a little bit about your book.
Well, Fighting Forward, a widow's journey from loss to life, is really has an interesting beginning. I have always been a journaler, and I've always written. Even when I was in ministry, I wrote, some like training materials. I wrote some devotional stuff that I used myself. I mean, personally, for different things I did. Always sort of processed through writing. And so after my first husband died, I just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote as a way to process these things that would come up for me. I didn't have any peer support, and I couldn't find a support group. I had a
Mm,
counselor. She wasn't a grief counselor. She was wonderful. She listened, but I just had all these things that I was afraid to say out loud. You might say it, and I didn't have anybody
mm.
to say it to, so I would write about it. And I actually did not finish my undergrad degree until I was 50. I had started at the traditional age and then had
Yeah.
kids and then worked. And anyway, I was decided to go back and finish my undergrad degree. And it's an interdisciplinary degree, which gives you a great deal of, I guess, room to explore. And I had an advisor who was like a professor emeritus. She was like, just did advising. She didn't really see students in the classroom anymore.
Okay.
And she said, "You have to do a senior project to graduate. What do you want to do?" And I thought of all these research projects and everything. I said, "I really want to write a book
Mm-hmm.
about my experience, but I don't know if that's academic enough." And so I sent her some things. I edited a few sort of things I had written, and I sent them to her. And she was like, "I believe this could be a valuable resource. Throw a few statistics into your introduction and resources into your ending." And then let's just basically beg forgiveness and not ask permission. And so I
Oh
did it
wow, I
for
love
my,
it.
yeah, yeah. Now, interestingly to me, anyway, was she was very, had a very different background than I did, but she took her, what I wrote, she's even used it in her church, which it's not, I don't consider it to be at all like a Christian resource, although I do
Mm-hmm.
mention my faith in it. But it was interesting because we have very different backgrounds, but she felt like it was helpful to her, even as she sort of, you know, um, she came from, I mean, just an extremely different,
Mm.
and it was interesting connection for us. She still occasionally checks. She's very elderly. And she checks on me and, how are you
Oh.
doing? But anyway, so after I used it for my senior project, I edited it and added some things and did some different things, make it a little longer, and self-published. It is self-published, um, which was, so I always just say I kind of wrote my way back to, I don't know, back to sanity. It's kind of how
Oh.
it felt. Yeah, I
Okay.
felt like it kind of helped me process. And I get a lot of comments. It's a very honest book. It's a very authentic. I don't really pull any punches in it. Um, so anyway, that's kind
There's
of what
something,
about it.
yeah. No, that's wonderful. I think that's the one thing I really liked about your work is that it was very honest, it was very raw, it was vulnerable. And I think people that are grieving and are especially dealing with really difficult loss, especially, the loss of a spouse, one of the most
Mm-hmm.
difficult, heart-wrenching
Yes.
to navigate, I feel like it might empower them. It almost
Mm-hmm.
is like when they're reading your work because you're so honest and you're raw and you're not, it's not like a sugar coated,
Mm-hmm.
nice and neat, pretty thing. You're just really just sharing. People can go, oh, wow, I guess I'm not crazy or I'm not
Yes.
going insane. I'm not broken. I guess this is just unfortunately, a normal experience I'm having to experience these reactions. And I'm just going to have to find my way through and forward in this journey. So, no, I can imagine that your book has impacted many people and have given them language to
Mm,
maybe what they're feeling, which I think
yeah.
is one of the most important things you can do. So thank you, Jan, for introducing yourself. And Jan has been so gracious to come onto this program and to help me do a revisit episode. And a revisit episode is I get a guest to basically revisit one of the episodes from season one. And Jan, most appropriately, because of just her background, is going to help me do the grief and loss revisit episode. I shared a lot of knowledge, a lot of what I've learned, both personally and professionally as a bereavement coordinator and a grief counselor. But Jan, I know, has a ton of wisdom that she's going to be more than gracious to share. And just to get somebody who has a lot of lived experience, but also has a lot of professional experience working with grievers, both in individual and in group settings, is going to be extremely helpful. So thank you so much, Jan, for your willingness to come on. And I actually want to open up the episode with this thing that I've noticed, which is I think historically, especially in Western society and specifically in the United States, which is both of our context, we're both Americans, we seem to have this adverse reaction to even entertain or talk about death and dying and bereavement and grief and loss. These frankly universal experiences that we're all going to experience because unfortunately we're all going to have an experience of losing a loved one to death,
Mm-hmm.
and then eventually we're going to go through our own dying process whenever that happens. And these are universal realities. No one's
Yeah.
exempt from this reality. It's not like
Exactly.
you can make enough money or get enough fame or achieve something to where you're just absolved for the rest of eternity, having to deal with loss of all kinds. It doesn't just have to be the death of a loved one. There's lots of different type of
Yeah.
losses that cause grief. But why do you think, as a society, specifically in our United States context, why have we been so adverse to talking about this? And why is there just such a knee jerk reaction to, oh, we don't need to talk about this. We don't need to explore this. We don't need to prepare people for what happens when you lose a loved one or you go through a traumatic event and you have a grief response? Why do you think that is?
I think it's because we like to have a problem we can solve, and we can't solve this one.
Mm,
Like there's no, like, if you do these 5 things, it's fixed. I mean, like,
yeah.
really, the problem with grief is we've lost someone and we can't bring them back. So, like, the solution is not available to us.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a piece of it. I also feel like a lot of loss survivors will tell me, and I felt this way too, as if people acted like, you're contagious or something. Like, if we talk about it, if we get too close, it's a reminder of a really difficult reality that we don't really want to be reminded of. Um,
Right. Okay.
yeah. And so I think those are a couple of things. I think our very rugged individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I mean, like, death don't care. I mean, it's like, so like,
Sounds like a t-shirt. Death don't care. Like I should.
so, I feel like there's like, it's just this reminder of you can't, control is an illusion.
Okay.
Things happen to us that are out of our control.
Yeah.
Like, we may not know what causes it or why. I mean, there's a lot of existential questions that come
Yeah.
up in grief and from death, and a lot of them are really hard to look at. And so I feel like that's a piece of it. Like, it's almost seen as a weakness of some sort.
Mm,
Um, like, if like, positive psychology is really popular right now.
yep.
Which, I mean, I'm all for having a good attitude, but you cannot think your way out
Mm,
of it, right? You can't be positive enough not to get cancer or whatever. I mean, so I feel like it just sort of flies in the face and is a reminder of these really hard things. I mean, this realization that, people die, and
yeah.
things happen that we cannot control and that we didn't ask for, and that we can't effort our way out of. We can't be good enough to avoid, just like you said earlier. I think that's the key. There is no way to be good enough to
Mm,
not die. And so it's a stark reminder of that. And it kind of flies in the face of sort of a lot of the, I don't know, like, prevailing social thought of the day.
gotcha. Gotcha. No, that's all really, really good insight. One thing I wanted to ask you too is, do you think COVID-19, we're filming this a year, it's been over
Mhm.
a year and 3 months ish in the United States since COVID-19 first became a pandemic in the United States and we went into lockdowns all over the country. That happened around February, March of 2020. So it's been, at the time of this filming, a little over a year. Have you noticed maybe the conversation shifting because of COVID-19 and because of just the pervasiveness of this disease that has ravaged our country, hundreds of thousands of people succumbing to this disease, millions becoming bereaved? I
Mhm.
mean, millions upon millions becoming bereaved because they have lost a loved one or known of someone who has died due to this disease. Do you think the conversation shifting? Are we making headway into maybe talking about this and really being real about grief and loss and death and dying and those aspects?
I feel like for some people it has.
Okay.
For people that are, willing to admit that it happened, or that it's, like, I've still seen people sort of um pull out but they had, you know, diabetes, or they were overweight
Mm,
or whatever, they were elderly. So it, like, almost like
yep.
dismissiveness of the deaths, right?
Yep.
For them, I don't know. I don't think so. I think for them, there's still that effort to put it over there away from them.
Mm, Mm,
somehow it doesn't count for me. And so for them, no, I don't think so.
okay.
I think for a lot of people though, because it's changed their lives in really pronounced ways, even beyond the death of loved ones. And we had, especially early on, we had families that lost like multiple family members.
Hmm.
Like before there was, like, now they're learning a little more about treatment. I mean, they weren't. There was just like no hope. So people were
Right.
like living in the same house, and that multiple people would die.
Yep.
So, but then people have lost jobs.
Hmm.
People have lost relationships
Yep.
over the response. And so I think, or people have lost just, what we think of as everyday things, like how, um, I don't know, normal things you would experience in life, like having a wedding, having a few, just the kind of
Right.
everyday things,
Yep.
right? I mean, um, and so I think that has maybe opened the door to discuss grief in a larger way,
Mm,
beyond just, I mean, certainly about death, but also about other losses, like you mentioned earlier.
yeah.
Um, so, I think it's cracked the door open. I feel like I hear more conversations about it.
Okay.
Maybe I'm just sensitive to the word grief.
I
I
think
know
I
it's
think I
a
am too. Yeah. Full
word.
disclosure. Yeah.
But I still feel like, there's a certain segment of the population that still wants to sort of believe this doesn't apply to me, or if it does, I can handle it.
Gotcha.
Like
Okay.
I got this, and
Is
you know,
that just a wider psychological response? Is there just something within us that just makes us have this very like distanced, very like hands off or just shove it over there approach to very hard circumstances? Is that a normal psychological response a lot of people have? Why do you think people still have this very dismissive or just very distant attitude toward
I
really
think
real things?
I wonder if I have wondered if it's a defense mechanism, right? If
Okay.
I have to believe that this could happen to me. I can remember sharing with a family member that I live in a very small rural town in
Mm,
North Alabama, and I'm not super plugged in, honestly, but I know of about 5 or 7 people my age that died of COVID in our little town.
wow.
So, and
Wow.
I said that to a family member, and they were like, "Oh, there's got to be like some other reason, like, oh, like it's like a cluster." Like, I'm like, "Well, yeah, they were around each other." I mean, I don't know, but it's like it just have to explain it away, right? Like we just still want to explain it away because we don't want to believe it will touch us.
Mm,
And I can remember they were like, "Well, they probably had a pre-existing condition." And I remember I said, like I do. I have asthma. My dad's sitting next to me. He has heart issues.
okay.
You're sitting here. You just had a pacemaker put in. You got a pre-existing
The
condition.
same person that you're saying is like being dismissive also has their own health issues
Yeah.
that could
I'm
easily,
like,
yeah, yeah,
So I think, but I do think it's a defense mechanism, right? It's a
okay,
way to just not allow the unthinkable to come near, in the same way that I'm sure you see this in your work, where people are literally actively dying
yep,
and family members are still unsure that they're actually dying.
yes,
You know what I'm saying? They're in hospice,
yes, it does happen.
Yes.
It's a phenomenon that fascinated me when I started doing hospice work
Mhm.
several years ago, which is like, how can this family member still have this completely like denial
Mhm.
attitude, and they're right there in the room and I'm right there next to them. I'm saying either ritualistic prayers or just reading scriptures, playing
Mhm.
comforting music. I'm trying to do everything I can as a chaplain to really make a supportive, calming, soothing environment so that this
Mhm.
person can die in peace and in comfort. And yet you'll still have this family member over here that's either super religious, and so they're like, oh no, this person's still going to be healed, or even if my mama dies, we're going to pray for a resurrection. I've
Mhm.
actually dealt with that a few times. Or
Mhm.
just people that are maybe not even a religious thing, they're just can't fathom that this person is in that moment that they're
Yeah.
going to die, and they're just, I think, just so afraid of even that possible reality of happening. And
Sure.
so even though it's right in front of their face, physically right in front of their eyes, somehow the mind, I don't know what it is, but somehow that mind will still keep them in that particular mindset until unfortunately it hits them, because it's going to hit you one way or the other, whether no matter
Mhm.
how long you try to prolong it or deny it or dismiss it or
Right.
avoid it. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's really fascinating. But that's why I wanted to bring you on, because you have had your own experiences with
Yes.
grief, and you also work with grievers primarily. And also, I know you do, as a professional therapist, you and licensed therapist, you do lots of other work. You work in lots of other, fields and mental health issues. But it seems like you have become known as somebody who is an expert in grief, and that's why I really wanted to bring you on. But I wanted to ask you this. This is one of my favorite topics to do with grief experts, or just people that
Okay.
have had a lot of grief experience, is the myths and misconceptions of grief. And
Oh,
we have a slew of them in the
yeah.
United States. And I think these are probably universal all across, the world to an extent. But what are some of the major or most common myths or misconceptions you hear about the grieving process or about grief in general?
Well, I think the first one is that it's just some linear process,
Yeah.
like stair steps. I kind of, I've done a lot of study and a lot of reading, and I've done a lot of extra training in grief work.
Hmm.
And even, so like people have heard of Dr. Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief,
Right.
which of course her research was done on terminally ill patients, not on lost survivors.
Correct. Yep.
Um, and I believe from everything I've read and heard from people that have worked with her, she she meant it to be like, these are my observations. I
Hmm.
observe that these are the
Hmm.
things, sort of the pattern, right? This is not like, it's not prescriptive, it's descriptive, like
Yes.
I'm describing what I've seen.
Yep.
Again, people who are dying, not people who are left behind.
Right.
So um, she was actually very angry that her work has been basically sort of reduced, right, to this 5 steps. And so people come in often and they'll be like, they'll sit down and they'll say, so where am I? Like, how much longer will it be? Like, I'm on step 3. So I feel like
Yeah.
people envision uh like a set of stairs, and like if you're on the third step, oh, I've only got 2 more like steps to go through. And then, like, I mean, nobody says this, but it almost feels like they're like, oh, then I'm done, like I'm over this is done, we are complete. And I always make this joke, borrowed from my mentor, Alan Wolfelt, who I've
Hmm.
trained with.
Wow, he's wonderful.
He's
His
phenomenal.
resources I share with
Oh
so
yeah,
many people. So
yeah.
if you guys don't know Alan Wolfelt, really quick, look up Alan Wolfelt. Wonderful, wonderful person, and a lot of great.
Centerforloss.com has lots of
Yes,
resources.
yes.
Yes. So
Anyway, yeah, go on.
So he says that this idea of stair steps, like that it's just this clean, sort of, you know, predictable, linear process. He says that's just wishful thinking.
Mm,
And so, I always just like, nobody gives us, like, we don't climb this set of stairs and then somebody gives us a medal and we're done with the grief Olympics. I mean, like, that's just not how it works. And so I think that's the most common misconception. And I think
yeah.
Dr. Wellfeld's right. I think it comes from this, what we would like it to be like, right? Wouldn't it be nice if you knew, like, oh, the grief process is 10 miles long and you've walked 6 of them. And so you've got 4 more miles to go.
It
Um,
goes back to that prevailing societal attitude you mentioned, the rugged
yeah,
individualism, pull yourself up by the bootstraps.
got a
Things have a
solution.
Yeah, things have a process, a
Mm,
beginning, a middle, and an end.
mm,
Like you said, that linear thinking is very pervasive in Western society, especially.
yes. And it's very difficult to explain to people that the grieving process is, first of all, deeply spiritual.
Mm.
You don't have to be religious. By that, I do not mean religious. I mean
Okay. Yeah.
inward journey. It's an inward journey. You know
Mm.
what I'm saying? Like
Yes.
the adjustment, the adapting,
Yeah.
the grieving. I mean, all of that is like, I mean, it's not, um, there's, you can't touch it a lot of times,
Mm.
right? Like, it's not like you can like do ABC and then, but there's like a change within us that has to occur. And so by
Mm.
that, I think it's just very deeply emotional and spiritual. And
Yeah.
that can be really hard to put your hands around, right? Like to get some significant, because every person has a spiritual being with, I mean, you know what I'm saying? That regardless of belief system. By that, I just mean, your inner world, maybe is a good way to
Yes.
say that, right?
Yeah.
So, because I've worked with everybody from people that were Muslim, Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
atheist,
Mm-hmm.
to, Pentecostal, African American Pentecostal, Catholic, nothing. I don't have any idea what I believe.
Yeah.
Token, what I would call like, oh, I go to church. I went to church as a kid, but I don't now. I've
Okay.
heard
Yep.
everything, and the same questions arise for all of them. They may
Mm.
voice them differently, but the same kind of inner, what I would call inner world existential kind of questions come up. So that can be difficult because people want this like concrete thing,
Yep.
right? Like, um, so that's probably the biggest misconception I see, is that there's like this nice and orderly way, and that you can control it, might be the second misconception
Okay.
that goes along with that, right? Like I
Okay.
can sort of somehow, I mean, I'm not saying you can't contribute to your own healing, but I'm just saying like you can't master it in some way and subdue it.
Mm.
Which is another thing Dr. Wolfelt says, something like this. This is not a direct quote, something along the lines of, most people see grief as a problem to be overcome instead of an experience to be lived.
Wow. It's powerful.
It is powerful and it's
Wow.
very profound. And when people can relax into that, they make, they do make more, progress is the right word, but anyway, they do make, they do have movement in their grief and mourning, as opposed to this, I'm gonna like, wrestle it down and subdue it somehow, um so I think, there's, maybe also along with that is that there is some final solution that we
Mm.
can like do that will keep us from feeling this way or whatever. Megan Devine, are you familiar with her work?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
She says some things cannot be fixed, they can only be carried. And
Mm.
that is a really difficult truth to live.
I think her book is It's Okay to Not Be Okay. Is that
Yes,
right?
that's
Yeah.
and she even has a good grief journal that I have just fairly new,
Okay.
that, that is great, and it's called something like "What Can't Be Carried," "What Can't Be Fixed Has to Be Carried." Something about, it's from that quote, but it's a journal and it's got it's an interactive journal, so it's not just a blank journal, and it's got activities and stuff which I find to be helpful for some.
Yeah. No,
So
she is wonderful. I've been recommending her works for a good bit, and have engaged with them myself. Her Facebook is actually really good.
it
I'm
is.
not on Facebook a lot, but if you're on Facebook, that's the one of the very few Facebook pages I'm like always looking at is
Mhm.
Megan's, because
She's on Instagram too.
okay, you see, and I'm on Instagram more. So there's hope for all you Instagrammers, which is way more people than Facebook people probably. She's on Instagram too, but like I just see her on my Facebook all the time, and she has
Yeah,
so much wisdom,
so
and
much. Yeah.
she's just
She's
really, really
able to wed that clinical knowledge with her personal experience in a very accessible way, I feel like.
yes,
Um, so I think those are some of them. I think
yeah,
another piece of misconception that I see is, sort of this idea that if we avoid our grief, that's like success. Like we confuse
mm,
stoicism or avoidance almost with like, um, in other words, we think if we're not experiencing sadness, then we're somehow succeeding in great, whatever. Like that's like the,
gotcha,
and
yep,
that's like the total opposite of
yeah,
what you do, so,
yep,
you need, people will say, well, I just cried and cried and I just felt so bad. I'm like, like, is it appropriate to cry about this thing?
yeah,
And they're like, oh, well, maybe so, or understandable. I use that word a lot. Is it understandable that you would cry about that? That's
mm-hmm,
bad for you. And they're like, oh yeah, so I think there's this
yeah,
idea that like the avoidance piece, that kind of goes
mm-hmm.
avoidance piece instead of embracing. And so really in grief, we almost have to embrace our pain, which
That's
is,
one thing I have to remind people is a lot of people have an avoidant attitude. And I've heard this from many grievers. They've said to me, if I'm afraid to start crying because once I start crying, I'm afraid I'm never going to stop. I
yeah,
think I've heard that phrase more times than I can count from grievers.
I,
And
yeah,
it's like they think that by just like keeping it inside and stuffing it, that it's just going to magically like disappear. Like it'll just like dissolve or disappear if they just shove it in, when it doesn't actually work that way. It's still going to come out. It's just, are you going to be are you going to be a part of that experience of allowing your emotions to come out and to explore them and work through them and disentangle and actually allow yourself to feel? So it's basically, are you going to allow yourself to feel, or is it just going to, are you going to, it's just going to explode? Because it's going to happen one way or the other. It's either just going to explode if you keep on shoving it down, and or you can actually deal with what's happening in front of you and work through it and find some empowerment that, you, like you said, it's an experience to be lived. It's not a process that has like, oh, okay, I'm gonna complete this, and it's gonna be
Right. We can't like manipulate. It's not schoolwork, right? I mean, we can't
right.
we can't like complete all our assignments and then
Which
it
for
just
analytical people, or people that just want to like have this, okay, my checklist, I did this, okay, I'm now and done. And I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way. So would you agree? There's a meme that's been going around a lot, at least in my world. I mean, but like I said, we're grief people, so
Mhm.
we probably see stuff most people don't see. But anyway, I've seen this with like the ball in the jar,
Yes.
and you had like the top line and the bottom one, and the top one is like that the ball gets smaller as time goes, and but then you have the other one where it's the ball stays the same size, it's just that the jar gets bigger, and what that represents is that our grief doesn't shrink over time, but that we grow around our grief, that there's like a growth aspect to the grieving process, that it doesn't necessarily shrink, but that we've learned to adapt and adjust and allow this experience to become something that we embody and that we actually grow as a person. How do you feel about that? Do you agree or disagree with it? I mean, I've just seen it go around. A lot of people seem to be
Yeah.
gravitating toward that as an understanding of grief.
I do think there is growth possible in grief. I don't say that to early people early after
Hmm.
loss. I mean, that sounds
Hmm.
really, tacky to me.
Yeah.
Like, "Oh, you're gonna learn from this." I mean, like, I mean,
That
like,
is not, yeah, you're right. That's not something you want to say like
yeah,
to a fresh
very
griever. Yeah.
insensitive.
Yeah.
But people that are later on, like like let's say somebody's, the year mark and they start asking some of these like, well, what's next kind of question.
Mm.
Or,
Hmm.
what do I do with my life? And how do I want to change my world or my life, the way I live in light of what I've experienced? Then we talk about how have you grown? What has this taught you? What do you feel like? How do you feel you're different because of it?
Mm.
I don't know that I agree that the grief doesn't reduce at all,
Okay.
because I, I don't think it ever disappears. And I don't know
Mm.
that I mean, I don't, that's a piece that's kind of hard for me to gauge. I feel like I think about my late husband and feel sad about that every day still.
Mm.
It's 7 years in August, but it's
Wow.
certainly with not the same intensity.
Okay.
And with the work I've done, much more at peace with, even though I feel, this kind of thread of sadness, it's not overwhelming. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Mm.
it's not like, um, so I don't know. I mean, I feel like surely my grief has gentled in some way in
Mm.
7 years. I hope so. I had an experience early on, and maybe about 3 or 4 months after he died, where I got so hysterically upset and could not calm down and cried. Like, I thought I would. And I called a friend, and I
Oh
was like, "I
wow.
think you need to take me to the emergency room." I don't know what I thought the hospital would do, like knock me out, maybe. I don't know. Just make it stop, sedate me, so I
Yeah, I was
can
about to
just
sedate you or stabilize your mood or whatever.
I
I
don't know
don't
what I
know.
thought.
I
I
have
was
no
just
idea. Yeah.
quit. I mean, like I was just like I was like crying so hard I would like throw up.
Oh
And I think
wow.
people do get really fearful, of that piece. And so I don't feel in that way that active sadness. I don't feel that to the greatest. I mean, I miss Phil in different ways now, but like that harshness of the early grief. You know what I'm saying? Like that has
Yeah.
gentled, and thank
Okay.
God. I'm so thankful for that,
Yeah.
because who could live in that? So I kind of have questions about that piece, but I do believe there is growth, a possibility of growth.
Okay.
I don't think it happens automatically.
It doesn't happen automatically. Okay, so that leads us right into what I want to talk about, which is how to cope with grief and loss. You've just shared, I think this is a perfect segue. So you've just shared, how over time that your grief hasn't fully disappeared and
No.
that you are still saddened about losing your late husband.
Hmm.
but the intensity that happened, the intense emotional responses that occurred in the first few months or maybe first year for you, you're not experiencing those intensities anymore that you once did.
Right.
So I think just a good question to ask at this moment is, what are some healthy ways that you discovered both personally in your life, and also what have you recommended to your clients who are dealing with grief, especially profound grief, intense grief, possibly even complicated grief, even though I think statistics are saying it's, I think, around less than 10%. I've
Mhm.
seen 7% or 8%, up to 10% of grievers deal with a thing called complicated grief, which is a
Right.
whole nother subject we could probably just have
Yes.
another episode on. But what have been some of the things that you've done, and then what are some of the things that you've recommended on people to really like get a handle and get a grip on their grief so that they can have some ownership in their journey and progress forward?
Well, uh, we know from research that one of the most important things for any resilience after trauma, any kind of like traumatic event, like
Mm-hmm.
natural disaster, even
Mm-hmm.
for instance,
Mm-hmm.
um, is support. Uh,
Mm.
so having a good support system, which of course sometimes is not as available depending on our situation. This is why I'm such a proponent of grief counseling and grief support groups,
Mm-hmm.
because they provide sort of a built-in support, right? Like they're not the same as having a friend necessarily, but they do provide a space to openly discuss your grief and to have some education around what you're experiencing, which provides normalization. Both of those things provide normalization, which is
Okay.
important. Like you said, like we want to know, like, have I lost my mind? I mean, like, I don't know. Is everybody else like forgetting to pay the water bill and they turn the water off, which
Mm.
happened to me. Um,
Yeah.
has there, can everybody else, like, do people have like memory gaps? Like, is this cognitive
Mm-hmm.
fog normal? And
Mm-hmm.
so, time with other loss survivors of specific, particularly, like I know grief share is, I've never been to grief share. I've heard people say good things, but it's just everybody, no matter what your loss is.
Right.
But the research shows that if you can be with people of a like loss, so loss of a spouse, loss of a parent, maybe, whatever, like you're in, so if you can kind of be in a group, if you can find a group, which sometimes is the problem,
Yeah. Yep.
uh, that can help you to just have that normalization, that like survivors, you can talk about, you know what I'm saying? This is what you, it is just very interesting to me. I lead groups, and that is the thing that I find very interesting is like the normalization. It's like a light goes off for people. They're like,
Mm.
and a relief, so that's important. The grief counseling is, I think, provides something slightly different in the sense that you do get to say sometimes things that you just don't have anybody to talk to about,
Yep.
especially when there are any kind of complicating factors or difficulty in relationships or trauma involved.
Mm.
Um, a therapist can provide that space. That's what I always tell people. "Hey, this is your hour. And if you want to say, I'm mad and I am whatever you need to say, like, you don't hurt me. I mean, like, just say what you have to say, and we'll talk about it." So I think just having like to not edit yourself in some way in a
Mm-hmm.
safe environment, safe support can be really important. Um, the other thing, and I think education becomes a piece of that. Again, that kind of goes back to the normalization, but education
Yep.
kind of is important because you helps you know, like, is this normal or not normal or what. But another thing that I find is really important is just radical self care. Um, I work a lot with widows, not just with widows, but I work a lot with widows.
Okay.
And I always say, I know you've spent probably all these decades taking care of other people, but it is imperative that you take care of yourself right now. Like, you have to pay attention to what you need. You can't just keep running on empty. A lot of them, lots of times when someone's been ill, caregivers are exhausted.
Yep.
By the time the person passes away, they may have physical ailments. They've probably, a lot of times, they've ignored their own health.
So true. Yep.
So I'm always like, just like very radical self care, like just taking care of um, your own body, your own needs, whatever, in whatever way that looks like. Getting in touch with even what that looks like for you. Like, so many people, they're like, I don't have any idea what, I don't even know where to start, so identifying that. Um, I always encourage people to do, like, when they feel like, with it, oh, I think, I really want to do this thing. That's, it sounds silly, but I think I want to do XYZ because it makes me feel close to them or whatever. And I'm like, well,
Mm.
does that hurt? Go ahead and do it. Like, so I encourage people to listen to that inner kind of urging, you know what I'm saying? Like that inner
Yep.
voice, to pay attention to that. Those are some really big things. There are all kinds of resources online, even like support group, like groups. I don't know that they're really support groups, but they're like peer groups, let's say,
Yes. Right.
online. And sometimes that can be helpful to just connect with other people. um, but I am really big on, it doesn't hurt to have another piece of support, and you're, so, um, just reaching out and letting people know what you need if you can. Like, if they ask, say, this is what I need. But that feels like really hard for most loss survivors.
Yeah, so that leads me into the last thing, which is how can people be really truly supportive of the grieving? Because I think a lot of times either somebody, whether it was well intentioned or not, will just say something, do something to really make the matter worse, and they might hurt that person more, and it might, make them withdraw more or turn them off from receiving that outside support, maybe isolate them more. Or what many people do is they're so afraid of maybe saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing
Mm.
that they just don't do anything, and
Right.
then that person is still left isolated and withdrawn
Yes.
from the community and from friends, family, and peers because they're either not doing anything or they're doing the wrong thing. But I know we have the ability to do the right thing. So,
Mm.
Jan, what are some things that people can do to really truly support those who are grieving in healthy and just really good ways for the griever? So to not hurt the griever, but to empower the griever and to make them feel loved and supported.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I would say is to realize that the funeral's the beginning.
Mm,
So many loss survivors are like, well, for like 2 3 weeks people reached out, and then it just disappeared, right? Like, so I, then nobody really checked or anything. And so,
yeah.
and those loss survivors are, they're not going to say like, hey, I'm hurt and I need help. So I think the biggest thing that I would say is, you don't have to do everything, in the first week. um Maybe just space it out and be patient. Like, if you
Mm,
invite someone to lunch or whatever and they say no, well, just keep on, being a friend. Like, keep
yeah.
on being consistent. They may say yes. So many loss survivors will say, I really don't feel up to going, but it is nice to be invited and remembered.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
you know, so like, they understand that it sort of feels illogical to other people, but that, they're not really up to socializing, but yet they don't want to feel like they're living in this hole, or whatever. It's really important too, not to, I think most people don't know what they need.
Yep.
So I feel like saying, well, let me know if you need anything, while nice offer. And I've done it. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not, you know, not guilty of this. Intention is very good, but most loss survivors, they don't know what they need. And so I would recommend offering something concrete, like, as an example, I'd love to bring a meal for your family. Would next
Mm,
Tuesday be a good day? I'll be there at this time. Would that work? Or think about practical needs, especially again after that week or two, like, you know, the yard still needs to be mowed. um if they have younger children, things still need to be handled. You know what I'm saying. I mean, like,
yeah.
practical needs are still there. So
Yeah.
there's practical needs, but also some of us have the gift, not everyone, of just being with people, you
Mm,
know and so, you can always just ask, hey, I'd love to bring over, whatever, okay, whatever you want to do. And you just sit for a little bit, keep you company if you want to. And don't be, I think the biggest thing I would say is, don't be offended when people, say no.
yeah. Right.
and then stop, right?
Yep.
Because people just are very overwhelmed. And so sometimes they can't, but just continue on being a friend, right? Like don't be afraid of it. I think. And then just be careful what you say because, you know, there's no like magic switch at 1 year.
That's right.
There's no timeline nobody's like bad if they're still crying after. I've
Yeah.
had people say, "Oh, it's been 4 months." I'm like, "Your child died. I mean, you're gonna still cry. I
Yep.
mean, they cry for 20 years. I mean,
Yeah.
off. I mean, like that's terrible. So of course, so sometimes we can feel pressure. Like, oh, I can remember someone saying, "Oh, are you still sad about that?" And I was like, "Yeah, forever." So just be careful that there's just like you know, you can be simple. You don't have to have any answers. And I think that sometimes that's what people feel uncomfortable, like they maybe have to have an answer.
Yeah.
Don't you think that you see that people?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, these are all super wonderful and super helpful. So the inner minister in me was like hearing consistency and offering your presence, concreteness, and offering like actual tangible things because the griever may not know what they need, but you can offer something. Companionship. So just being willing just to sit with someone and
Mhm.
just not have an agenda, not have to like worry about saying the right things or doing the right things necessarily. It's just being there, just being present has a power for
Yes.
somebody, just to
Yeah.
feel that they're not alone. And then care in your conversation. So make sure that if you are going to talk, if you are going to be supportive in your conversation, take good care and think about what you're going to say and make
Mhm.
sure that it's something that's helpful, nothing something that's not hurtful. Make sure
Mhm.
you avoid trite sayings and cliches and those things that just don't really have a lot of care attached to them. So those are the four, I guess, four C's you just said. So inner ministers and us, I love to alliterate still. So it's just
The
like,
other like little piece of that, I guess, is like more detailed of that would be to remember special days.
mm,
Um,
that's a good one.
not just like, I mean, the death anniversary is hugely significant to most
Yep.
people, and most people don't really. I don't have anybody that reaches out to me on that day.
Mm,
Um, but also birthdays, anniversaries, even Mother's Day and Father's Day can be really quite painful.
mm,
Just
yes.
any kind of holiday at all. I can remember being surprised because I just felt so sad on Memorial Day, which we'd never done anything on Memorial Day, but people kept putting up pictures of people like out, and
Oh,
I was just home by myself, and I don't know that we'd ever done
mm,
anything like big, but I just felt so alone,
yeah, that's a
so
good point.
even reminders, even like things that aren't direct can be hard. Church can be really difficult if you go to church with people, like maybe sitting with them so they
Yeah.
don't have to sit alone. If they're like, I think of course, that's more like a widow, widower, but you
Yeah.
know, but still like remembering and talking about their loved one if you knew them, because people quit doing that too.
Ooh, do you think it is a good thing then to talk about it? Because I think a lot of people are afraid of, well, I don't want to bring so and so up because then that's just going to make them sad and upset and things like that. Or does it actually, is it more hurtful to not bring up the person
Well,
when
you
you're,
don't have to like be nosy about the day. You know what I'm saying? Like, depending on your relationship, you don't have to like ask a lot of questions, but like if you have a favorite memory or something you
mm,
loved, I mean,
there you go.
I
Yeah.
love hearing my mother was a teacher. My mother passed away 3 years after my husband.
Mm,
And I love hearing people talk about both of them and
uh-huh.
talk about my mother. I live in a town that she taught a lot of people. And so, uh, but still, um, it doesn't come up as much. And my husband, my kid, I mean, people do, but it's just kind of sad. I feel like I
Yeah.
have to give them permission to do it almost.
Mm,
And I love
mm,
hearing the stories about how they were loved and funny things they did or said or whatever. I
that's
would
good.
take my cute, I mean, to some degree, if they feel uncomfortable, then don't. But I mean, for most people, they they want to have a place to remember, and they want to hear how other people loved their person too.
That's
So,
really great advice. Thank you for sharing that as well. So, yeah, so, sharing fond memories. Like you said,
mhm,
don't be nosy about the details that might be painful or people don't want to revisit, but just sharing a fond memory is going to
sure.
make that person feel, loved, and it'll remind them of, oh, wow, this person did make such an impact on so many people's
Yes.
lives, and their memory is just something to be treasured and valued, and that other people treasure and value that person's memory as
Right.
well. That's really good. Well, what I do on every episode is I just give you the last word. So, any last parting wisdom, anything you just want to share that you haven't shared so far, or just anything you want to leave with those,
Mhm.
especially those who are grieving and are just really dealing with difficult times because of their grief and their loss.
Well, if if you have lost a loved one, I know at first it feels really hopeless. I have been there. Um, I could not really imagine how I could go on. In fact, I could not imagine that I would want to.
Mm,
And that can be an incredibly lonely place to be. Very isolated feeling, very hopeless feeling. And so I would just say, there is hope. There is a path forward. It can feel really difficult at times, but your worth, the work the of grief, your
mm,
worth finding help, your worth paying attention to your loss. Your loss is important. Your loss is uh, deeply impactful. It's not a small thing you've been through.
yeah.
So there is hope. Honor your grief, honor your loss, but also honor yourself. You know,
That's wonderful. And thank you so much for wrapping up our conversation there. So, we have had Jan Owen on the program, licensed therapist, author of Fighting Forward, A Widow's Journey from Loss to Life. You can check her out on all the social media. She has a website as well. And we'll put all of her details in the description and in the program. Jan, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciated all your insight and your advice, and I trust that this is going to help a lot of people. So thank you.
I hope so. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And thank you so much for watching and for listening. And remember, you have one life, make the most of it, and we'll see you next time. Bye.